So hi everybody, my name is Yin. I'm a Taiwanese immigrant, currently a settler on Squamish, and Muckleshoot territory of Seattle. And I am an organizer with Parasol, Pacific Rim Solidarity Network, which is left Chinese, Taiwanese, Hong Kongese rejects. And I'm also part of ILPS, International League of People's Struggles. It's a league that was formed by Palestine, Philippines, and Netherlands, and also part of CID Coalition's Hambao's Now Hotels, which is the Chinatown International District, fighting over 100 permits in our community, luxury condominiums and hotels that are 14 to 17 stories high, when our current, it's about 5 or 6 floors now. And I'm also part of the Seattle People's Party, which is the third party that was started to run Nikita Oliver for mayor, a different kind of candidate. That we didn't make it through the primaries because they threw a lot of Democrats at us. So I work in a lot of intersects of anti-displacement, climate change, and ending the school to prison to deportation pipeline. I'm going to be talking about my relationship with capitalism, and then I will share how lawyers have been showing up in our Seattle grassroots movements, and then share some of our theories of change as women of color speak out. So my parents met at an Adidas factory, and I grew up in the factory. And that's a narrative that I kind of got disconnected from until I visited China in the fall last year and was able to be with the workers that make iPhones and laptops, and in capitalism, those stories are so disconnected. What they told me was, they know about the American poor, but the American poor don't know about the Chinese poor. They have over 700 million workers. The US population is 300 million. They have 700 million workers, and of course the narrative that gets told about them is, how the system is working well for the 1%. And so, in the factory narrative, as we immigrated here into the US, I lost my parents to capitalism because then they work all the hours nobody wanted on the weekends and evenings. Then I lost my culture to capitalism because then now my parents weren't around to teach me my language, my culture. And then I lost my father to capitalism because then now he was in his coping, in his trauma, and his addictions. So that's all very real for me. And I think there was other. And so I think it was through the relationship with Mother Earth that brought me to the climate and environmental justice movement, although it was still very individual, isolated, removing blackberries, ivies, recycling, putting logs in the river so the salmon can spawn. It was such an individual, and also I take on that I come from a culture that internalizes a lot, and so I internalize the shame of not doing enough, and internalize the systems of oppression or the fossil fuel industrial complex, and how I'm consuming to be here. And so in order to shift that narrative from individual actions towards a collective movement action, it was through the Shall Know. When the Arctic rig was parked in Port of Seattle, then that brought in the intersect of the government, of the nonprofit industrial complex, and of the grassroots, mostly people of color, indigenous, Black folks, that then we all, our path intersected, and that's how I got into the grassroots movement, was at that point, in building those relationships. And so the lawyers that have been showing up on the grassroots front lines have been the Northwest Detention Center Resistance. It's the biggest detention center in the Pacific Northwest, is in Tacoma, Washington, and lawyers have access. There was a call out earlier in the fall by the organizers for lawyers to show up, not to provide legal service, but just to be able to go in to the detention centers to talk to the folks on the inside and be able to report out back to the organizers on the outside, so that we know what the demands are, we know what's happening on the inside. And I think that is important to recognize the access that lawyers have. When we were forming the third party to run our political candidates, the lawyers that we had helped us write the platforms so that it was in those legal terms, helped us build what it means to have a third party, all the 501c4 nonprofit industrial complex processes, and also the same lawyer was also the one that wrote a moratorium, a pause to stop development in San Francisco. And those are all very heady, important access terminologies that we needed. What we saw is that when even lawyers that are just in school that haven't got their degree, when they put on those green National Legal Guild hat, that the police were a lot nicer to us, because now they're being documented. It's a form of cop watch that is so important, that how they treated the Black Lives Matter activists in Seattle was totally different, because now there is some other person that's there holding them accountable. And also a lot of lawyers are leveraging their relationships that they have with judges and attorney generals to be able to get people out without bail. And that's a leverage of privilege. One thing that happened in Seattle earlier this year was there was a symposium between lawyers and activists. It was grounded in the movement histories that happened in Seattle, and also they heard from the movement elders from WTO from the 60s and 70s. So it was a space that the lawyers and activists were convening together to meet each other, to build that relationship for that kind of solidarity. So that's the happenings. The theories of change for WOCSO Speak Out, there's, if you look up, there's some tech talk, 3.5%, that is the number. 3.5% a continuous nonviolent direct action is how an empire, dictator, overlord is overturned. That is all the population that we need of continuous nonviolent direct action. It has to be nonviolent so it's accessible to everybody, and it has to be continuous. 3.5%, and I think when looking back on the civil rights movement, I think only 4% of the nation actually supported that. And so, when that's our theory that we hold. Who we engage are those that are ready to. And we do believe in caucusing. We have formed a white male caucus group who works on smashing patriarchy. We formed 3 white feminist groups in Portland, in Seattle, with the island, to dismantle white feminism. We started a men of color group for them to dismantle themselves. And youth of color speak out. So those are, we believe, because the system treats them differently, and they have privileges, and then they need to be able to speak to their people about how, what they gain and what they lose in the system. And so, I just want to share, like when the alarm goes off, when my fire alarm goes off when I'm cooking in my studio, I run around in circles. And until I'm able to breathe and then start fanning my fire alarm. So there's 12 years left. People respond to that urgency differently. Maybe they're still running in circles, or maybe they're ready to fan, or maybe they're ready to address or put out the fire. What does it look like for lawyers to show up on the front lines? What does it look like for a lawyer of color speak out group? What does it look like to recognize that the single most powerful legislation that Patty mentioned are the treaties? What we have legally already exists, and how do we use that to ensure that this earth is livable and accessible